everyone. My name is Moira Armstrong. My pronouns are they, them. I am a graduate student at Birkbeck, University of London, and I am a research assistant for the Queer Pandemic Oral History Project. My presentation today is called Disabled People Have Suddenly Discovered That They Can Do Things Like the Rest of Us, Disabled Queer Connection During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And this presentation has a content warning for ableism and general experiences of disabled people during the pandemic, which if that is something that might be challenging for you to listen to, this is probably a presentation you're going to want to sit out. So today I'm briefly going to give an overview of the Queer Pandemic Project. Then I will discuss pre-pandemic disabled belonging in queer space. Then I will discuss during the pandemic, the increased accessibility that began. Then I will discuss the quote unquote post-pandemic phase and the loss and isolation that returned for many disabled people. And I will wrap up with a section called The Future is Disabled, Wild Disability Justice Dreams and Queer Communities. So first, for a brief overview of Queer Pandemic. Queer Pandemic is a collaborative oral history project between Kent State University, Goldsmiths, University of London, and Queer Britain, which is the National LGBTQ+ Museum of the UK. And since the fall of 2020, the project has been collecting oral histories with queer people in all 4 countries of the United Kingdom, which are England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We use a general interview guide with 4 sections: biographical questions, experiences during COVID-19, the impact of queerness on those experiences, and the government response to COVID. And we also have a disability-focused interview guide that I put together. It has the same sections as well as additional questions about the impact of disability on pandemic experiences and the overlap of queer and disabled identities. I point this out because some of the people included in this presentation were interviewed with the general guide and others with the disability-focused guide, which I wanted to flag because I think it really highlights how important disability has been to disabled people's experiences of COVID, even when they weren't asked about it specifically. With the general interview guide, disabled narrators talked about the impact of disability extensively. So I will now move into sort of the pre-pandemic landscape and disabled belonging in queer space. And it's a big question to answer whether queer community was accessible before COVID-19. It's really hard to make such a broad statement that can apply to all iterations of queer communities. There are inconsistencies across time, place, type of disability, and target audience of a space. The interviews generally demonstrate that accessibility has improved with time as more awareness of disabilities and disabled leaders have become part of queer spaces. It is also different depending on location. So larger cities like London are more likely to include accessibility than small towns, as well as the exact accommodations that are needed. There is also the issue of access friction, in which 2 different people's access needs may conflict. Liz Jackson coined this term, and it describes, for example, a queer club might be step-free and accessible to a wheelchair user, but the lights and sounds make it inaccessible for an autistic person. And then finally, a space's target audience can greatly change accessibility. The interviews have shown that queer spaces that intentionally incorporate intersectionality are more likely to be accessible. So as considering how broad and varied the answers to this question are, no one quote from the oral histories can represent the answer, but I've picked one from Ju Gosling, who is a queer and disabled activist, writer, and artist that discusses lack of accessibility and the impact that can have on queer people. For 25 years, we've been saying it's not good enough to take a vote on which one film at the annual film festival is going to be interpreted. It is not good enough to have just 2 wheelchair spaces and then either side of the cinema. It's not good enough to do such and such. Prior, issues around pride, which has got less and less accessible for the last 20 years. And I think straight people find it really hard to understand that, again, certainly in the UK, if you don't go to those spaces, you don't see your friends. You never visit them at home. Access to those social spaces is critical, and it's already been something that as soon as you're disabled is just cut off. So now I want to discuss the changes that came up during the pandemic and a pattern of increased accessibility. I'm going to talk about one of our narrators, whose name is James. James is a trans queer man living in Manchester, and during the pandemic, he started a project called the Gender Community Lending Library, or GCLL, which is a nonprofit that distributes trans books to people around the UK. James started the GCLL soon after contracting COVID when he was struggling with post-viral fatigue and feeling particularly cut off from queer community. And he reflects in this quote here, "Because everyone's moved online, I think that has been a real boost to little ventures like GCLL." Because so many people were spending more time on social media, his project gained visibility, which helped him feel a greater sense of connection. He also describes in his interview that running GCLL allows him to engage with queer community at his own pace, and its nature as an ongoing, virtually based project allows queer people who connect with it to do the same, which I see as a reflection of Crip Time. Crip Time is a, quote, flexible approach to normative time frames that, quote, bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. I am quoting Ellen Samuels' piece, 6 Ways of Looking at Crip Time here. And Samuels is in turn quoting Margaret Price and Alison Kafer. I find GCLL a really great example of pandemic-informed Crip Time. When James started this project, he was dealing with post-viral symptoms on top of his chronic illness, and instead of forcing himself back into his previous ways of connecting with queer community, which were not friendly to his disabled body-mind, he dealt with isolation from that community by creating his own project that allowed him to create connection in a way that worked for him. It was slow and on his couch rather than a fast-paced night out that would put him at further risk. So now I want to wrap up by talking about sort of this quote unquote post-pandemic phase that we're in and the loss and isolation that came along with it. And I want to pose the same question as earlier. Is the queer community accessible post-COVID? And I first want to acknowledge that the pandemic is not over from an epidemiological standpoint. Thousands of people are still contracting COVID, being hospitalized, becoming disabled with long COVID, and dying, and healthcare systems are overloaded with patients. However, many people do consider the pandemic to be over, in part because in the UK, all stay-at-home orders, mask mandates, social distancing requirements, and other mitigation measures have been lifted by the government. And unfortunately, most queer spaces have also lifted these preventative measures and also stopped offering virtual alternatives to their programming. And this is problematic because many disabled people know that the pandemic is not over, know that they are still at risk and can't go back to unsafe in-person gatherings. So they remain isolated from queer communities as a whole, as well as queer friends and partners who want to engage with in-person spaces. And next I'm going to read a quote from Stuart, who is a queer non-binary tattoo artist who has cancer, talking about this issue. Stuart says, "You don't want to control their movements, but it's also in the back of your mind of like, well, you have to be careful." And we have had to have conversations sometimes when a friend of theirs, tested positive and then they had dinner plans and all these kind of things, and sort of asserting your boundaries to be like, I love you, but this is my health and I have to really do that. That those conversations kind of always happen because of cancer. But then this extra layer on top, and then the fact that this layer starts to impact people's sociability and their connections to friends and community. It's tricky. In this quote, Stewart voices the complexities of being disabled and trying to have relationships with people who want to go back to in-person community when they cannot. They continue to say that sometimes they feel like a burden for asserting their health needs, even though it is a literal matter of life and death. And I think this quote really demonstrates how serious this issue can be. So I want to wrap up on a high note. I'm drawing the title of this section, The Future is Disabled, Wild Disability Justice Dreams and Queer Communities, from Leah Lakshmi Pyapsna Samarasinha. The Future is Disabled is her latest book, and in this book, they discuss that if projections are accurate, the majority of the world could soon be disabled because of the effects of the pandemic, climate change, and other factors. However, they feel that this can lead to possibility. This is a quote from chapter 6 of the book. If we really are the majority, if masses of people, parents, teachers, low-wage, high-vulnerability workers, are already lying down, quitting, organizing Amazon's first union, and gathering to primal scream at night out of utter exhaustion, could there be so many of us we are impossible to ignore? Will the masses of us have the collective power to fuck the world into justice? Even if we don't make the revolution the way I continue to long for, the world will be permanently, fundamentally changed and full of disabled possibilities. I argue that this has already happened in some corners of queer community that originated during the pandemic, but carried through to this post-pandemic phase. And I want to draw specifically on one that was raised over and over in our oral history interviews, which is queer house party. So there's an image on the screen. It's a screenshot of an Instagram profile. The profile photo is a red, white, and pink logo showing a plant in a pot and a high-heeled shoe on a turntable. And around it, it says Queer House Party. The profile shows the username Queer House Party, and then the blue follow button and the white message button, and then an icon showing a person with a plus sign and 3 black dots. It then shows the profile statistics, 794 posts, 28.2K followers, 177 following. And then the profile reads Queer House Party, rainbow flag emoji, house emoji, sparkle emoji. If I can't dance, it's not my revolution, then a fist emoji. DJ collective, community platform, and award-winning queer party that's accessible, radical, DIY, and punk AF. Queer House Party started during the early stages of the pandemic, when lockdowns and group gatherings like actual house parties were not permitted. This provided an alternative to keep DJs employed and provide queer people the ability to connect to community even when staying at home. This is a particularly radical example because Queer House Party has stayed remote. There are now in-person offerings, but they're always live streamed. And at least last time I was there, there's about a 50-50 split between remote and in-person attendees. And I realize that I am short on time here, but I want to connect Queer House Party to the principles of disability justice as they are laid out by Sins Invalid. So those are intersectionality, commitment to cross-movement organizing, which you can see in the overlap of queer space and disability awareness that Queer House Party demonstrates. An anti-capitalist politic. This originated as a space of mutual aid and has platformed providing resources and other mutual aid efforts for intersectional communities and organizations. Recognizing wholeness, centering queer and disabled joy, even in a time of attacks from all sides, particularly in the UK, and collective access, continuing to be virtual, even as most queer spaces have not done so. So that I will go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you so much.